Welcome, one and all, to our wonderful webinar with Stephen Meyer. He is the director of the Center for Science and Culture at the Discovery Institute, a graduate of the University of Cambridge in the area of the philosophy of science, a geophysicist. He's the author of fantastically important books in the topic of evidence for intelligent design, Signature in the Cell, and Darwin's Doubt. Dr. Steve Meyer, great to have you with us. Thank you for joining us from Seattle.
Thank you for linking me in by Zoom here, Tom, to your wonderful group. And I'm really happy to be here and to be able to share some of the ideas and evidence from my new book. I understand you had John Lennox in your last session. He's a hard act to follow, but I think our approaches are very complementary. So he talked about the question of whether science had buried God, and I'm sure he said no. And what I'm going to share today is that there's actually positive evidence for not just an intelligent designer, but an intelligent designer who has the attributes that traditional theists, Jews, and Christians have long ascribed to God. So I'm going to share the screen and kind of jump right in here.
Can I just make a quick mention as you're sharing your screen?
Go ahead.
You were able to bring a presentation to a group in Guatemala. I don't know if I heard the rumor that it was 100 or more students, professors, scientists, and I'm just excited that you're penetrating the larger world outside the United States even. And we are really excited to say that we have a group probably of several hundred listening tonight from several dozen countries. And let me just mention in the ability that people have to suggest a question. You can use the button at the bottom left of your screen for Q&A, and that's where anybody who wanted to either suggest a question, write a question, and once the questions are submitted, then we're going to have an opportunity to vote a question up or down. So you don't have to wait until after Dr. Meyer has completed his presentation. It'll go for about a half an hour, and then we'll entertain questions, and there will be that process of using the thumbs up to vote a question up. And so, Dr. Meyer, thank you so much for joining us, and we are truly, truly thrilled to know more about the return of the God hypothesis and your lecture, your presentation. We've been anticipating for weeks, really months, and so thank you for joining us live from Seattle.
Fantastic, Tom. I'm noticing here as I try to share a screen that the options I'm getting are not options that are on my laptop screen. There are other things, so I don't know if I can actually access the slides. I don't know that that's going to be a great deficit for tonight, so maybe we'll just go with a strictly oral presentation and a couple of visual aids, if that's all right, unless there's a quick and dirty way to find the access to my PowerPoints on my laptop.
I think that's okay. And let me just mention that I think that if we can direct those who did attend the seminar tonight to online versions, similar in the last couple of weeks or months, you have presented with slides, we can do that.
Actually, that's great, because I did an hour-long version of this talk for our Science and Faith Conference last year in Dallas, and that is on the Return of the God Hypothesis.com website now, and it's a much more extensive presentation, but less time for interaction. So why don't we do this in a little bit more informal way, okay. And then we'll have more time for the discussion. I'm seeing some questions already popping on the screen about the multiverse, for example. So let me start with a story. In fact, this is something that happened during our one of our Science and Faith conferences. I was doing an interview with Eric Metaxas, the well-known New York-based talk show host. And it was about the thesis of this book, that there is actually scientific evidence in support of the existence of God, of the God hypothesis. To my left, there was a young woman who was manning one of the cameras. And during about halfway through the interview, it became apparent to a number of people that she was weeping. She was visibly weeping. And of course, everyone was quite moved by that and wanted to find out what was going on with her as she was listening to this interview. And she later sent us her story and told that she had not quite entirely lost her faith in college, but very close. She was a biology major, and by all accounts was quite a very good science student, was destined to go on to grad school, but she was encountering so many professors who were presenting the case for scientific atheism in their classes and arguing, as she put it, that if you understood the facts of science, there was, quote, no way that you could actually also affirm, at least reasonably affirm, the existence of a creator or God. And she found this cognitive dissonance, she told us, so difficult to manage that she decided not to go on in science and to instead take up film production as her postgraduate career. But she had always retained these unanswered questions. And when she heard Eric and me talking about some of the evidence that I'm going to describe today, she began to visibly weep because she realized that there might be an answer to her questions after all, and that there may be a way for her to be both a person of faith and a person who affirmed science and to affirm the best evidence that we have about the natural world that's come from science. It was a very moving story she shared with us, and not an unusual one at all. I've lectured on many college campuses. We do a science and faith conference every year in the East, in Philadelphia, and the same bereaved mother comes and gives me an update every year on her son who went to MIT and lost his faith there, taking advanced level science courses with professors who were also aggressively proselytizing students in support of a kind of atheistic or materialistic worldview. It's also not hard to understand how students have come to this perception. Of course, they encounter it with professors in college, but also there have been some very prominent voices in our culture over the last 15 or so years. Starting in 2006, there have been a spate of books that have been published under the banner of the so-called new atheism. It's almost a genre in popular publishing. And authors like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, Lawrence Krauss, even Stephen Hawking got into the act before the end of his death. Victor Stenger, who wrote a book called God, the Failed Hypothesis. Of course, the most famous of these books was Richard Dawkins's book, The God Delusion. And his argument was that that science properly understood undermines belief in God. And a big part of the reason for that, he argued, was Darwinian evolution. He said, up until the time of Darwin, there was the most powerful argument for God's existence was always the design argument, because it was based on publicly accessible evidence from the natural world. But after Darwin, he said, we learned that appearance of design in biology could be adequately explained by an unguided, undirected mechanism known as natural selection that could mimic the powers of a designing intelligence without itself being designed or guided in any way. And so after Darwin, he said it was possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. And he went on to say in another one of his books something very provocative. He said that the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if at bottom there is no purpose, no design, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. And blind, pitiless indifference is, of course, a way of expressing the concept of a materialistic worldview, where a worldview is a kind of comprehensive philosophy. I'm sure anyone affiliated with the C.S. Lewis Society is aware of what a worldview is. But if we think of a worldview as a kind of personal philosophy, or one that's held whether formally or informally, and the idea coming out of the late 19th century, after Darwin, Marx, and Freud, and other similar figures, T.H. Huxley, was that the idea that the universe had always been here, that the prime reality, the thing from which everything else comes, is matter and energy. And of course, every worldview has to answer that question of what is the thing or the entity or the process from which everything else comes. And after the 19th century, it became almost the default way of thinking in science, and certainly that perspective percolated into the wider culture, that the thing from which everything else had come was self-existent, eternally existent matter and energy. The natural world was all that existed. There was no creator, designer, or God beyond the physical world. Nature was all there was. Now, this perspective, according to Dawkins, is strongly supported by the observation of the properties of the universe. And in my new book, Return of the God Hypothesis, I first praised Dawkins for framing the issue so beautifully clearly. And Dawkins has a talent for that, as do many of the new atheists. They really want to know whether God exists or not. They argue that he doesn't, and science shows that he doesn't. But I take Dawkins at his word that you can test a worldview or a metaphysical hypothesis by examining what we see in the natural world to find out whether or not it comports with what we would expect if a given worldview were true. But then I challenged Dawkins in the book and other new atheists by showing that the evidence that we have is exactly what we would not expect if a naturalistic worldview were true, if a materialistic worldview were true, especially the evidence we have about biological and cosmological origins. And so today, in the brief period of time we have for this presentation, I just want to describe 3 big discoveries that have been made, tell you a little bit about how they've been made and why they challenge the strictly materialistic worldview concept that Dawkins has advanced. The first of those discoveries has occurred in the field of astronomy and cosmology, or you could also add the discipline of astrophysics, which is kind of in between. And the discovery that was made that first kind of shook the confidence of scientific materialists, in particular about the idea that the universe was eternal and self-existent, that it had always been here and therefore did not need an external creator. The first big discovery that shook confidence in that view was the discovery that the universe is expanding. And this started in the first inkling of this occurred in 1912, and a little-known American astronomer named Vesto Slipher discovered that the nebular structures that you could observe in the night sky, which were thought to be at the time probably clusters of gas out within the Milky Way, that these nebular structures were exhibiting light that looked redder than it should look. The light was being stretched out. Red light corresponds to longer wavelengths. Most of folks know, if you've had a science class, that if you shine light through a prism, it will separate into red to violet and the colors in between. And the red light corresponds to light with a long wavelength. And so light coming from these distant objects in the night sky appeared redder than it should look. As we looked at the spectral lines that astronomers could examine, they were all shifted towards the red end of the spectrum. All the lines had longer wavelengths than they should. And that was the first clue, but at the time it wasn't really recognized. The significance of the clue wasn't really recognized because astronomers still thought that the nebular structures were just clusters of gas in the Milky Way. But in 1923, Edwin Hubble applied some new techniques that had been developed by the astronomer Henrietta Leavitt at Harvard University. Hubble was out at Caltech at the Mount Wilson Observatory. He was using one of these great new domed telescopes, the 100-inch Hooker telescope it was called. And he was able to, first of all, get some very beautifully resolved long exposure photographs of these nebular structures. And it turned out they looked an awful lot like galaxies in their own right. But then in examining one of them, the Andromeda galaxy, one of the ones closest to us, he discovered that using these new data, or these new distance measuring techniques developed by Henrietta Leavitt, he was able to determine that the Andromeda galaxy was 900,000 light years from planet Earth. And that was very significant because the accepted distance measurement for the entire scope of the Milky Way at that time was 300,000 light years. And that meant that the Andromeda galaxy must lie beyond our galaxy, and it must in fact be a galaxy. It wasn't merely a cloud of gas within the Milky Way, it was a separate galaxy. And it was moving away from us at a very rapid rate. Slipher had discovered the evidence of so-called red shift of the light coming from these nebular structures. Now, Hubble was able to determine that the nebular structure was actually a galaxy. that it was beyond our Milky Way and it was moving away from us. And as he and other astronomers made subsequent measurements of the light coming from distant galaxies, they realized that almost all of them were moving away from us. And that suggested a universe that was expanding in a spherically symmetric way, like a balloon. And here's my promised visual aid. If you imagine all the galaxies in every direction of the night sky moving away from us, and this was something else that Hubble discovered, and that is that the further the galaxies were away from us, the faster they were moving away. And that observation could only be explained by postulating a kind of spherical expansion. So we can think of the universe as expanding like a balloon as follows, where each puff represents a little bit more progress in the forward direction of time. So we have the universe with the galaxies. See my beautifully drawn galaxies on there? Sorry about the elementary visual aid. So you've got the universe expanding in the forward direction of time, but that raised an interesting question about its history. What if we back extrapolate? What if we think about what the universe would have been like 1,000 years ago, or 1,000,000 years ago, or 1 billion years ago, however far you want to go back, however long ago you think however old you think the universe is, as you go back in time, the matter from those galaxies would be getting closer and closer and closer together till finally, at some point in the finite past, it would have congealed to one point, marking the beginning of the expansion and also marking the beginning, arguably, of the universe itself. Now, this is a mind-blowing concept, and it was developed in the 1920s, but there was a parallel line of discovery that was taking place in theoretical physics that confirmed this. This was Albert Einstein's idea of general relativity. And according to Einstein, gravity worked as massive bodies literally curved the fabric of space, or what he called space-time, because space and time were connected in his physics. And so you could think of gravity as affecting a massive body affecting another massive body, kind of like putting a trampoline on or a bowling ball on a trampoline, and then thinking what would happen if you put a tennis ball on the edge. It would kind of follow the curvature of the trampoline into the center to the bowling ball. Now, Einstein realized that if gravity, as he had conceived it, if that was the only force operating in the universe, then we should exist in a kind of black hole. Everything would have congealed to the middle and crunched. But since we don't live in a universe like that, and since there is empty space between massive bodies, he postulated that there must be an anti-gravity force, something pushing space apart. And he called this his cosmological constant, a constantly outward pushing force. But he also did something else that was a little bit of a gerrymander. And that is that he proposed that the amount or the strength of that force was exactly equivalent in the opposite direction to the force of gravity, such that he could portray the universe as existing in a kind of constant static balance, equiposed between outward pushing and inward pushing. Now, that was a bit of a gerrymander, I say, because there were virtually an infinite number of values that he could have proposed for the cosmological constant, and all but this perfectly finely tuned value would imply a dynamic universe, either expanding or contracting. He knew it couldn't be contracting because everything would be crunching together. And so he rejected the idea of a dynamic expanding universe, largely on philosophical grounds, because he liked the idea of the universe existing from eternity past without having had a beginning. It fit better with his naturalistic or materialistic worldview, the one that he held at the time. He later changed his worldview quite a bit. In any case, as I like to say in the book, the heavens talked back. This evidence of redshift was incorrigible. The astronomers kept detecting it in every quadrant of the night sky. And further, other theoretical physicists, including Georges Lemaitre, the famous Belgian Catholic priest who was also a very prominent cosmologist, solved Einstein's equations and showed that even with that value that Einstein had chosen to get everything to balance, the universe would not be stable. We lived in a dynamic, evolving universe that appeared to have begun from a finite time in the past. That was the most natural and logical implication of Einstein's equations. In 1927, in a taxi cab ride, on the way to a very prominent conference in Europe, Einstein and Lemaitre rode together, and Lemaitre confronted Einstein with the results of his calculations, or his own work on Einstein's field equations, his gravitational equations, and also then told him about the redshift evidence. A few years later, Einstein was again confronted with this evidence at Cambridge University by Arthur Eddington. And then finally in 1931, he went out to California, met with Hubble. There's some famous newsreel footage of Einstein peering through Hubble's telescope. And then a couple of weeks later, he gave an interview to the New York Times stating that he now understood that Hubble and his colleague Humason had shown decisively that the universe was not static, that it definitely had a beginning. And he later said his attempt to fiddle with his own equations to circumvent the conclusion of a beginning was the greatest mistake of his scientific career. Now, why was this discovery of a beginning so troubling to so many physicists and astrophysicists and cosmologists? A later physicist, Robert Dicke, explained very clearly, a Princeton guy. He said, an infinitely old universe would relieve us of the necessity of explaining the origin of matter at any finite time in the past. But with the convergence of the evidence from observational astronomy and theoretical physics, a new model of the origin of the universe had developed, which implied that there was in fact a beginning. Now, in my book, I tell about the many other lines of evidence and other developments in theoretical physics that have supported this conclusion, but it's a powerful conclusion, and one which challenges scientific materialism, because if the universe had a definite beginning, then it becomes impossible to posit a materialistic explanation for the origin of the universe, because after all, it's matter and energy that are coming into existence at the beginning, before which there was no matter and energy to do the causing. And so to explain the origin of the universe adequately, one necessarily has to postulate an entity which transcends matter, space, time, and energy. And for many reasons, which I explain in the book, the postulation of a God hypothesis there makes sense and provides an adequate explanation, whereas scientific materialism does not. Now, the second big discovery that has, I think, challenged scientific materialism and has provided support for not just a thesis of intelligent design, but a theistic design hypothesis, is the discovery of what physicists call the fine-tuning. We apparently live in a kind of Goldilocks universe where the fundamental forces of physics are not too strong, not too weak, where the masses of elementary particles are not too heavy, not too light, where the expansion of the universe and the force driving it is not too strong or too weak, not too fast or too slow. And the initial conditions of matter and energy at the beginning of the universe, the configuration, the order present in the initial conditions of matter and energy were just right to allow for the possibility of life. And physicists have called this evidence the anthropic fine-tuning evidence, the idea that the universe seems to be finely tuned for the possibility of basic chemistry, of life, and even of higher intelligent life. It was a setup job, is basically what the physics is saying. And one of the physicists who opposed the Big Bang on philosophical grounds, Sir Fred Hoyle, who was in his opposition a strident scientific materialist, later shifted his worldview because he discovered some of these fine-tuned parameters that were necessary to account for the abundance of carbon, an essential molecule for life. And he later said that a common sense interpretation of the evidence suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics and chemistry as well as biology to make life possible. And I always say, I think it's rather amusing how the monkeys enter into the origins debate, even if it's about physics. But Hoyle's quote is very famous and also very illustrative of the intellectual shift that has begun to take place in physics and cosmology, as more and more physicists have recognized the power of this fine-tuning evidence. Now, there is a counter argument to the fine-tuning design argument, and it's something called the multiverse. And that's the idea that there were so many universes beyond, there are other universes beyond our own, so many, in fact, that the right conditions, as improbable as they seem, necessarily would have had to have arisen at some point, just because there were so many universes out there. And in the Q&A time, I would be happy to address the multiverse. I provide a multi-pronged critique of that idea in my new book. And it's, I think, one of the new things in the new book that I think will interest many folks, and maybe some of you. And I already saw there was a question about the multiverse. So we'll hold that off, but I want to flag that as something that we need to address. The third big class of evidence has come from biology. And if any of you have been following our work at the Discovery Institute, my colleague Michael Behe, or the work that I've done on the origin of biological information, you know some of the powerful new evidence for intelligent design that has been revealed in the inner workings of the cell. In the 19th century, biologists thought that the cell was a simple homogeneous globule of protoplasm. It's the way Thomas Henry Huxley put it. It was a simple clump of goo in a cell membrane. We now know that cells are complicated on the order of automated factories, that they have not only information embedded in the DNA molecule, but a whole complex information transmission, storage, and processing system at work in every living cell, including the simplest. In my previous book, Signature in the Cell and Darwin's Doubt, I have argued that the presence of that digital information and information processing system provides powerful evidence of a designing intelligence. In particular, because of what we know from our uniform and repeated experience about what it takes to generate information. It turns out, if you know anything about the whole field of chemical evolutionary theory or origin of life studies, that the attempt to explain the origin of the very first life by reference to simpler pre-existing chemicals has failed, and it has failed primarily because scientists have not been able to come up with a plausible explanation by which undirected chemicals could develop an informational code and an informational processing system. Getting from chemistry to code is proven extremely difficult. It would be like saying that you could explain a message written at the top of a newspaper by reference to the chemical properties that govern the bonding of the ink to the paper. Clearly, there's something else at work in the information. It's not governed by chemistry alone. In fact, information in our experience, our uniform and repeated experience, suggests the prior activity of a mind. Bill Gates, a famed software developer in the Seattle area here, has said that DNA is like a software program, but much more complex than any we've ever created. And that's a highly suggestive remark because of course we know that programmers make software programs, that software programs point to the prior activity of a programmer. And in fact, we know that whenever we see information and trace it back to its source, whether it's in the digital code in a computer program, or a paragraph in a book, or a hieroglyphic inscription, or information, for example, embedded in a radio signal, whenever we find information and trace it back to its source, we always come to a mind, not a material process. And so I've argued in Signature in the Cell and Darwin's Doubt that the discovery of digital information at the foundation of life, and the evidence we have for large bursts of new information into our biosphere over time, suggests the activity of a designing intelligence both in the origin and the history of life on our planet. So what can we make of these three big discoveries? We've learned from modern science that the universe likely had a beginning, that it was finely tuned for life from the beginning. And since the beginning, there have been big bursts of new digital information into the biosphere on our planet. I argue in Return of the God Hypothesis that when we look at those three classes of evidence, we can make an inference to the best metaphysical explanation or worldview explanation, and that explanation is theism. The three pieces of evidence taken together are all inconsistent with materialism. Materialism denies there's a pre-existing mind, and it denies that the universe had a beginning. It's also inconsistent with pantheism, the Eastern philosophical system, because the pantheistic God is coextensive with matter. God is in matter and matter is God. and there is no transcendence in the pantheistic conception of God. And the pantheistic God also does not have a mind. So the pantheistic God cannot account for evidence of intelligent design like we have in the fine tuning or in the digital code, nor can it account for the beginning of the universe, because before the beginning of the universe, before the beginning of the physical or material universe, there was no pantheistic God to do the causing. It has the same problem that materialism does. It lacks a transcendent causal entity which could act to bring the universe into existence. Likewise, a deistic version of God fails to explain all of the evidence. Deism might explain the origin of the fine-tuning or the origin of the universe itself, but a deistic God, by definition, does not act after the beginning of the universe, and thus can't explain evidence of design that arises much long after the beginning, as we see, for example, in the fossil record, or the evidence we have for the origin of life at a particular point in time, long after the beginning of the universe and earlier in the Earth's history. One of the other proposed metaphysical explanations has been the idea of panspermia. This is a little bit more bizarre, but it's the idea that there's an immanent intelligence within the cosmos that's responsible for the evidence that we see in biology and for the origin of life. This might, in principle, provide some kind of an explanation for the origin of life, except for two things. First of all, if you invoke an extraterrestrial intelligence as seeding life on planet Earth, which is what the Panspermia hypothesis proposes, there's no explanation for where the information came from to build that extraterrestrial intelligence. So it pushes the origin of information question back one generation without answering it. But secondly, the immanent intelligence of a space alien could not explain the origin of the fine-tuning upon which its very existence depends, because much of the fine-tuning has been present from the very beginning of the universe, and all of it was established before the origin of any evidence of stable galaxies and therefore of extraterrestrial intelligences. And certainly an ET couldn't explain the origin of the universe itself. And yet theism, I think, does provide an adequate explanation for all of these three key facts about biological and cosmological origins. The God of theism is intelligent and therefore can account for the origin of the information we see in DNA, the fine-tuning, but the God of theism is also transcendent and therefore can account for the evidence we have for the origin of the universe itself and the origin of fine-tuning from the very beginning of the universe. So that's what I call the return of the God hypothesis. And one historian of science, Frederick Burnham, says that hypothesis is now more respectable than at any time in the last 100 years. I go further in the book and argue that it actually provides the best explanation for these new and exciting discoveries we have about biological and cosmological origins.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Steve Meyer. We are ready now to engage in some very energetic questioning for you based on a number of people who have written in. And I just want to say what a thrill it is to see the arguments, the three arguments that you have summarized so beautifully coming together. It's like a convergence. And I think there's even additional evidence that could have been marshaled. I mean, the evidence from the fossil record, for example, remains as strong as it ever has been, as presented in Darwin's Doubt, your book, which had such a major impact. You had to write a second book to answer the critics and interact with them. So I would like to go ahead and first, if I could, bring up the multiverse discussion. And I know you've already presented it in brief, in a nutshell, that the multiverse question here, it really kind of hinges on is not the existence of other universes beyond ours. At first, a little bit suspicious in it being posited because of the lack of evidence, any direct evidence. And secondly, the question arises, could it be that these other universes could actually be colliding with ours? And so why do we see no interaction with other universes? How is it possible to even bridge or produce one universe from another? If you could just tackle some of those.
let me give you my take on I'll first explain the multiverse hypothesis and then give you my take on it. The multiverse hypothesis posits not just the existence of I always say a gabillion other universes, a whole bunch of other universes. But it also necessarily needs to postulate a universe generating mechanism. And here's why. If you just have other universes out there besides our universe, and they're causally unconnected to ours, and after all, that's what we mean by a universe, is a causally closed system, then things that happen in those other universes will have no effect on things that happen in our universe, including the probabilities that are involved in the establishment of the physical parameters that make life possible. So if there's no connection with these other universes, the other universes don't affect materially the probability of the fine-tuning being set in our universe, because they have no effect on our universe. So to circumvent that problem, proponents of the multiverse have necessarily had to posit universe generating mechanisms that would spit out lots of universes over time. And in order to portray the universe generating mechanism as a common cause of all the universes, and in order to portray the universes, or in particular our universe, as a kind of lucky winner of a cosmic lottery, because then you can make some meaningful probability calculations, and you can say, well, gee, even though the odds look very much stacked against getting the fine-tuning right in any given universe, given that there's so many that are being produced by these randomizing processes, lo and behold, we can explain their origin and explain the fine-tuning in our universe. There is a big problem with that, however, and it's commonly overlooked, and that is that the universe generating mechanisms that have been proposed, one based on something called string theory, another based on something called inflationary cosmology, themselves, these universe generating mechanisms themselves, require prior fine-tuning if they are to produce new universes, even in theory. And so the fine-tuning problem doesn't go away. Instead, the fine-tuning is just pushed back one generation and it is located in the universe generating mechanisms, but it is left unexplained. So the multiverse hypothesis doesn't actually explain the fine-tuning. It leaves the ultimate origin of fine-tuning unexplained. And yet we do know of an explanation that is sufficient to explain fine-tuning. What we mean by fine-tuning is a set of improbable parameters that work jointly to establish some discernible function or outcome. And the examples of things that are finely tuned are things like a French recipe, or an internal combustion engine, or a section of digital code. So whenever we see a fine-tuned system, those systems always have one thing in common, and that is that they were intelligently designed. So given that the multiverse doesn't explain away the ultimate origin of fine-tuning, and given that there's only one causal explanation of which we know for fine-tuning, the fine-tuning, I think, multiverse or no, still points to an intelligent designer.
Wow. It sounds like the fine-tuning hypothesis is on shaky foundation, to put it mildly.
Well, the fine-tuning's great. It's the multiverse that's on shaky foundations.
I'm sorry. That's as an explanation.
I knew what you meant, Don. No problem.
Thank you. Yeah. So we have a very interesting question. It looks like somebody was listening quite carefully to Dr. Lennox's discussion with us last week. And this question really deals with semiotics, and I almost would need to look that up in my dictionary of appropriate sector of knowledge. But let me just bring out what he says here. My question is in reference to the specificity. I think he's dealing with the DNA information.
Sure. Yeah, right.
I know that's your specializing focus here in many of your books. He says the specificity of biology information is in focus here, but in particular, is not the semiotic nature of information. And he elaborates, biological information is embedded and subsequently extracted from the string of nucleotides, okay, the A's, the T's, the C's, and the G's. And using that extraction process from the string of nucleotides, which was previously determined through various protocols and dimensions, the final result is then brought out. So the ultimate question is, do you, Dr. Meyer, feel that the semiotic nature, I guess the symbolic, this
yes, semiotics is the study of symbols, yes, and their function.
Semiotic nature of biological information have anything to add to the discussion and to the implication for a God hypothesis?
It's very interesting that this questioner should raise this. I've just had a fascinating email exchange with Professor Brian Josephson from Cambridge University, a Nobel laureate in physics, and he kindly endorsed the new book, Return of the God Hypothesis. But one of the questions he asked me was about was how semiotics fit into my whole treatment. I didn't explicitly address the issue of semiotics, but semiotics has to do with signs and symbols. And there is an implicit use of semiotic concepts in the book, because one of the philosophers that I invoke is C.S. Peirce, who was definitely the founder of semiotic theory. And so there's two senses in which semiotics applies to the argument for intelligent design. One is that the system of information storage, transmission, and processing in the cell is a semiotic system. The DNA conveys information not by virtue of any of the physical properties associated with the molecules or the nucleotide bases that are the subunits of the molecule. Instead, it conveys information because of the precise sequencing of those nucleotide bases in accord with a symbol convention, a semiotic convention, a symbol convention known as the genetic code. And that is not determined by the underlying physics and chemistry. It's physically and chemically arbitrary as to which nucleotide base attaches to which part of the message-bearing molecule. And it's also physically and chemically arbitrary as to how the code works. And so this is a classic, this is a genuine code we're dealing with inside a biological system. It's not a physical and chemical transaction entirely. There's something that transcends physics and chemistry that is informational and semiotic, which is governing the information transfer. Now, so that's one sense in which semiotics applies. This is a true sign symbol system, a system where a symbol convention is at work, and so that symbols can convey information. There's a symbolic transmission of information. But the other thing is there's another sense of semiotics here, and that is whenever we find systems of that kind, whenever we see information bearing sequences, that is itself a sign of prior intelligence. And that's where I've used C.S. Peirce in my development of the design argument, showing that what we can draw is a decisive abductive inference from effect back to cause, from sign of intelligence, namely information, back to the activity of intelligence. So there's both, in a sense, a horizontal sense of semiotics at work, where information is being transmitted within the cell, but the fact of that transmission and storage of information points in a vertical sense, if you will, to a prior activity of a designing intelligence.
Fantastically exciting and really shocking in a way.
And an amazingly insightful question too. That's a very high level question. Very interesting.
The question has come up to asking if you might just summarize in a short kind of nutshell framework.
A little shorter answer than the last one.
No. Your argument. No, your argument from the book Darwin's Doubt.
Yeah,
of course. That came from that. And if you could just sort of summarize where we are today, 7, 8, 9 years later, as the dust is settled, isn't like through the work of Gunter Beckley and others, isn't the argument even gaining ground? And
it's self-aggrandizing to say so, but I do have to say so. I think the argument of Darwin's doubt was that it was primarily about the Cambrian explosion, but the Cambrian explosion is just one of many bursts of biological form and information, discontinuous or abrupt bursts of form and information in the history of life as documented by the fossil record. The argument of the book was that there are two mysteries associated with that explosion of new form, the first animals in the history of life. One is the absence of ancestral precursors and intermediate fossil forms that would allow us to justify a gradual Darwinian account of the origin of animal form. But the deeper mystery, I argued, is the origin of the information necessary to build that form. Just as in our high-tech digital computer world, we know that to give your computer new function, you need to provide new information, new code. It turns out that something analogously true is the case in biology, and that is, if you want to establish a new form of life, you have to somehow access new information. That biological form requires information. So when we see a burst of new biological form in the fossil record, we're seeing evidence of the abrupt origin of a lot of genetic and other forms of biological information. And there I argued in the book that natural selection and random mutation does not provide an adequate explanation for the origin of that information. Mutational processes degrade information, they do not generate it. And the other newer evolutionary models have also failed to provide an adequate explanation for the origin of information. And yet again, we do know of a cause that is sufficient to produce information in large amounts of functional information, especially in a digital or alphabetic form, and that causes intelligence. And so I argued in the book that the Cambrian explosion, and I would now argue other similar explosions of form and information in the history of life, provide decisive evidence of the activity of a designing intelligence or mind in the history of life, not just at the point of origin.
Wow. And we have a whole series of other questions that are tumbling in one after another, and they're being voted up rapidly. One is, it's a very interesting question.
Hey, Tom, can I just add one quick editorial note to round that last answer out, because the questioner asked about the current status of that argument. People may know that there was a major conference held at the Royal Society in London in 2016, convened by leading evolutionary biologists who are dissatisfied with Darwinian evolution and are looking for a new theory of evolution, precisely because they recognize that natural selection and random mutation lacks the creative power to explain the origin of morphological novelty, of new form. It does a good job of explaining small scale variation, but not large scale innovation in form. And so I think even within evolutionary biology, there's a kind of an impasse generating. And so I think that the argument that we're making has not been effectively challenged, and that the case for design is on strong footing there.
Fantastic. Let me just bring up this next question and kind of I'm going to just do a slight editorializing of it. The question is, what's the strongest, traditionally viewed as the strongest evidence against the creation concept, the God hypothesis? And I'm thinking back 10, 20 years ago, maybe at least 15 or 20 years ago, you would hear the pseudogene argument brought up. You would hear other similar things brought up, like poor design in the way that, let's say, a certain blood vessel is looped around the chest of mammals. And so I'm wondering, what do you see, according to the question, as the strongest viewed evidence in the scientific arena against creation? And what do you think are the best responses coming out now against that?
Well, the objection that I most commonly hear is not actually an empirical one or a scientific one. It's a more philosophical one. The idea that positing an intelligent designer, or positing, as I do in the new book, an intelligent designer with the attributes that we typically ascribe to God, can't be a scientific explanation. But that's not a scientific explanation. And the response to that is and that's really a matter of classifying science. Okay, it's a definitional argument. Science has these particular attributes, and you haven't made a scientific argument. And what my response to that has been, I'm not really concerned about what you call the inference, whether you call it scientific, historical scientific, or philosophical, doesn't really matter. What matters is what is most likely to be true, and which possible explanation provides the best account of the phenomenon at hand. And so I address that. It's under the heading of something called the demarcation question. How do you define science and demarcate it from non-science? But the really important point is not whether the intelligent design is a scientific inference or not. I think it is. I think it's a properly historical scientific inference. But even if you don't accept that classification, what really matters is whether or not the evidence supports the design inference or not. And I think there we're on very strong grounds it does. Now, as a matter of evidence, the main counter argument to the design inference has been the problem of so-called junk DNA or pseudogenes, things that seem to be to lack function in the biological system. So, and this was very common, as you mentioned, up till about 2009, 2010. Well, Meyer argues that all this genetic information and DNA is evidence of a designing intelligence. Then why is 97% of the genome so-called junk DNA that doesn't perform any function at all? That looks like the process of, that looks to be sort of the leftovers of a random trial and error process. And then it turned out, as some of our early proponents of intelligent design predicted, that non-coding DNA actually is functional. And it's functioning something like an operating system in a computer domain where it's controlling the timing and expression of the coding files. And so it's actually very important information, although it's not coding for the production of proteins. It's directing and controlling the expression of the genetic information that codes for proteins. And so I think that's been, I think, a very decisive response to that. There's also concern about an evidential concern that we often hear is about poor design or malevolent design. What about bacteria that cause infections? What about viri? And I actually have a long footnote on this in the new book explaining, and this is something very new as far as developments that have been taking place in microbiology, but I've had some very long and productive conversations with my colleague Scott Minnick, who is a virologist and microbiologist, and he's pointed out that virulent bacteria and virulent viri are inevitably the result of a loss of prior genetic information, and that they're evidence of a degradative evolution rather than a bad aboriginal design. And so there's a kind of reversal, whereas the Darwinians want to say, gee, the evidence of bad design shows that God does not exist, but natural selection can account for all the good design. And I think a better way to look at life is that we have both evidence of aboriginal design and subsequent decay. And that's what you would expect if you were not just an intelligent design theorist in a sort of broadly secular sense, but if you were actually an intelligent design theorist who had a biblical worldview. Because in the biblical worldview, we're expected to see both original design, but also subsequent decay. In the book of Romans, you get discussion of both of those things. From the things that are made, the unseen qualities of the Creator are clearly manifest, Romans 1. But in Romans 8, you get the idea that the creation is groaning for its redemption because there has been this, since the time it was subject to decay. So we would expect to see both decay and evidence of aboriginal design. I think you see both. And that's one of the reasons I think that I'm not just I don't believe just in intelligent design without having a sense of who that designer is. I happen to be, though not all intelligent design proponents are, I happen to be a biblical Christian, and I think that provides a framework for explaining what's sometimes called natural evil or malevolent design.
Well, that's a perfect segue then to a question on a more constructive basis. We've actually had some people say, how can we be supportive of intelligent design? You know, how can we be an activist mode and prayerful mode? And so I think that maybe if you can toss out a couple encouraging things, developments that have happened in the last months or years that would really kind of give us a sense of there's some motion, there's some movement in maybe different parts of the world or in different things. And just how can we be supportive of intelligent design? Then we have some more technical questions.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that I'm really bullish about in the culture right now is the progress that's being made by this larger movement that we sometimes call the intelligent design movement, or by the intelligent design research community. In the last 5 years, we've been able to begin to support research projects at mainstream universities around the world. So the concept of intelligent design is not just something that's being used to explain facts that we already know about, like the digital code in DNA, or the molecular machines in living cells, or the patterns in the fossil record. Jonathan Wells, Michael Behe, and I, and others, William Dembski, have written books making the case for intelligent design. But other scientists and younger scientists working under older established scientists are starting to take the concept of intelligent design and to run with it and use it to generate predictions and to guide research, and are using it to make discoveries. One really exciting example of that is a research project that we've been supporting in Europe, where one of the scientists used some of the concept out of computer science to generate a testable hypothesis about the intelligent design of the genome. He suggested that he thought, well, if intelligent design is true, maybe we ought to be finding established design patterns, computer design patterns, where a design pattern is an established method of processing or storing information. And maybe we ought to find some of those in the living cell. And so he started to look for what are called overlapping genes, where you have messages layered on top of messages. That would be a sophisticated mode of encrypting or storing information. Lo and behold, he's found overlapping genes even in the bacterial genome. It's just an absolutely fascinating discovery, and one which would be very, very difficult to explain by reference to random mutational changes in natural selection, because it requires satisfying, in his case, 6 independent semantic constraints simultaneously. So this is a sophisticated mode of encryption that we sometimes use in cryptography, and we found it the foundation of life in even simple cells. So that's an exciting thing. So we're making great progress, I think, on the research, on both internationalizing and mainstreaming ID research. I am absolutely, I absolutely welcome prayer support. This is a challenging project at every level. So I never turn away prayers. And we would be very grateful if you know young people who are rising young scientists. We run a summer program every year for both scientists and scholars in the humanities, targeted at students who are late in their undergraduate program or grad students, and some postdoctoral students or postdoctoral researchers as well. And so if you know young people, send them our way. And we're always in need of financial support for to keep the research and the training and the outreach going. So all 3 of those ways are ways to help.
Well, we are just about out of time. I just want to say a thank you to you. I'm thinking maybe we could tackle one more question.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I'll just say just real quickly, one of the students or one of the participants has thrown out a question. Meyer makes a great scientific case for a creator God, but is this can it be kind of parlayed onto or made as an on-ramp to convey the evidence for the Judeo-Christian worldview, specifically the God becoming man? So that's something that there is a great variety of videos, some of them by Metaxas and Lennox and others, that could make that further case, right?
Well, yeah, what I'm doing is I think I'm taking the argument from nature as far as it can be taken.
Sure.
Initially, I argued for an intelligent designer of some kind, but then people asked me, who do you think the designer is, and what can science tell us about that? And that's what this new book is about. And by bringing in the cosmological and the physical evidence, I think we can make a very strong case. I think there is a strong case revealed in nature for the reality of God as the designer, not a space alien or a deistic God or a pantheistic God, etc. But I think if you're coming out of a scriptural framework as I am, I think scripture itself places limits on how far you can take such arguments. Romans 1 says that you can know the wisdom or the divine nature of God and his power, but you don't get the whole of Christian revelation from nature. And for that, you need to examine what theologians call special revelation. And I think some of the work that's being done, for example, by Titus Kennedy on biblical archaeology, defending the historicity of the Bible, or Lydia McGrew, or some of the great Christian apologists who have, Gary Habermas, William Lane Craig, many others have addressed those kinds of questions to adjudicate the next question that follows from my work, which is, well, which form of theism it makes the best sense? Is it a non-religious form of theism? Is it Islam? Is it Judaism? Is it Christianity? Those questions have to be adjudicated by other kinds of evidences beyond the scope of this book.
Well, it's been a real thrill to have Dr. Steve Meyer, one of my mentors, one of my tutors in these areas. And I want to thank you for tutoring not just those that are in the intelligent design movement, but the whole world through your books. I might just want to mention, it was your book, Signature in the Cell, was named by the very secular London Times supplement as one of the books of the year. And I think that's just typical. And I believe Thomas Nagel, if I can just close with this, is almost like the tip of the spear. Thomas Nagel wrote a book, Mind and Cosmos, and that book was influenced. He even names you, among other scientists, as influencing him. Isn't this show that we're getting close to a tipping point when a renowned atheist philosopher says Darwinian theory is gone just belly up?
I think it absolutely is showing exactly that. I think we're in the what Thomas Kuhn referred to as the latter stages, the early stages of a new scientific revolution. We live in an information age. Intelligent design can account for information. That's precisely what the 19th century materialistic theories of evolution and their subsequent 20th century theories have not been able to explain. And so I think minds are opening all over the place. When I was with you for your banquet a year ago, we talked about the book review written by David Galarenter, the very prominent computer scientist at Yale University, one of the architects of the whole concept of the cloud, and he's come to reject Darwinism, and he's not an advocate of intelligent design, but I think he's shown some appreciation for our work. And you have these types of intellectual conversions taking all over the place, even at very high levels. So I think scientific materialism is very close to being dead. Darwinism, which is the creation story of scientific materialism, I think is dead. Even evolutionary biologists acknowledge that there's a need for a new theory. So welcome to the world of intelligent design. We've got a lot to offer as the potential alternative to that 19th century way of thinking.
Well, let me just say thank you, Dr. Steve Meyer, for taking your time out. I think that you would surely encourage, as I would encourage people, to check out these daily developments surrounding your book and these issues at evolutionnews.org. Great source of information daily, correct?
Thank you, Tom, and thank you for all you're doing with the C.S. Lewis Society. You're teaching at Trinity, and you're teaching all over the world. You've been a huge proponent for these ideas for 35 years, as I have. We've known each other for a long time, and it's really exciting to begin to see a lot of the efforts that people in this larger network, what a wonderful team of people working on these things, scientists and philosophers and other scholars. I think it's starting to get traction, both here and other countries.
And really quickly, one of the greatest ways to order your book, and people should order 5 or 10, I recommend. Pass them out to everybody they know that is interested in this topic. They can order it through Amazon, of course, but do you recommend them checking out special collateral materials?
Well, we have a special pre-order on the book that's running for 5 more days that will allow people they get a number of free publications, a little booklet that I've written about intelligent design, also access to a special Zoom call, private Zoom call we're going to do with just a freewheeling Q&A, and a big discount on an online course that I've done on intelligent design with 40 10-minute episodes. It's very beautifully produced, and so that's available at returnofthegodhypothesis.com is the new website for the book, and also at discoveryinstitute.org / I think it's Medved, because we've been doing a lot of things on Michael Medved's radio program.
Wow.
So returnofthegodhypothesis.com, though, would be the best place to go.
That's the place to go. Well, we thank you for the opportunity to host you on our webinar series. We're looking forward to 2 weeks from now, the same night, Thursday night. In 2 weeks, we have Michael Behe, and then in 4 weeks, we have none other than Jonathan Wells, author of Zombie Science and Icons of Evolution, and Hilary Morgan Ferrer to top it out a week after that. So thank you, and we all say we appreciate you so much. We will support you in every possible way. We are praying for you, Steve Meyer, and for the Discovery Institute.
Thank you very much, Tom, and all those good wishes right back at you. So we'll thank you for giving me a chance to talk to your folks.
And thank you so many people across the United States and the world for listening to this Steve Meyer webinar. See you back here 2 weeks from now.